This video goes over the American Civil War and the period of time surrounding it. In the early 19th century, a series of religious revivals occurred, collectively referred to as the Second Great Awakening. Many people converted to Christianity. Around the time of the Civil War, about 40% of the population was Christian. More people immigrated from Asia and Europe. Immigrants were often rejected as Americans by people who'd been in America longer, often white people. This led to many immigrant and race-based minority groups developing collective identities and communities. After the American Revolution, America began to develop its own sense of identity. A big conflict was over slavery and states' rights. This conflict eventually culminated in the Civil War. America had been involved in two wars since the American Revolution, the War of 1812 and the Mexican War. The Civil War was extremely brutal and violent. Its death toll outnumbered that of both previous wars combined. 620,000 people, 2% of the population at the time, died. Many men served and fought in the Civil War, and many boys lied about their age to serve. To be a man was to serve, and consequently, to kill. The war was brutal. Confederate soldiers inflicted violence on African Americans who were captured and mutilated the bodies of those that had been killed. The Union Army was brutal and violent as well. Many men died, and neither army was prepared for the amount of deaths battles would bring. Soldiers were often buried in shallow, mass graves. Many Civil War soldiers were never identified, and there was no policy for notifying families. There are records of over 400 women dressing and passing as men to fight in the Civil War, but there were likely many more that went unrecorded. Women had an easier time passing as men due to all of the underage men that enlisted. Women fought in the Union and Confederate armies. Some women fought alongside their husbands, some enlisted because of their patriotism, and some may have enlisted to escape gender restrictions. Loretta Velasquez had a husband who enlisted in the Confederate Army, and Loretta wanted to fight alongside him. Her husband was against the idea, but Loretta ordered a uniform for herself anyway. She dressed as a man, went by Harry Buford, and declared herself a lieutenant. She recruited volunteers for the Confederate Army. When her husband died, she continued fighting. In 1862, she was injured, and an army doctor discovered she was a woman. She left the army and worked as a spy, donning both male and female attire. When the war was over, she resumed dressing in female attire. Some of the women who fought in the Civil War spent most of their lives dressing and passing as men. Albert Cashier was one of them. He was born a female in Ireland and immigrated to the United States. In 1862, he enlisted to serve in the Union Army. After the war, he continued to dress and live as a man. When he got older, he suffered from dementia and needed permanent care. He was put in a state hospital, and the doctors there discovered he was born a woman. He was forced to wear female attire. The story spread through the newspapers, and the public learned he was born a female. His fellow veterans were surprised by the news, but they supported him and protested the way the hospital was treating him. Cashier was buried in his full military uniform under the name Albert Cashier. The United States did not acknowledge the existence of female soldiers in the Civil War at the time, but the public was well aware of them. The idea that women could join the army and fight contrasted society's idea of a subordinate, passive woman. The public openly speculated about the women's motives for enlisting, and held a similar fascination for the cross-dressing women that the public held for Deborah Sampson in the Revolutionary War. Before we move on, I'd like to quote a passage about women in the Civil War from Michael Bronski's A Queer History of the United States. It would be naive to think that their fighting was not as brutally murderous as their compatriots. It would also be naive to believe that the women who fought for the Confederacy did not hold abhorrent views about race. Walt Whitman was a nurse in the Civil War. He experienced same-sex desire and had relationships with other men. Walt Whitman also wrote poetry, and some of his poems were likely inspired by his experiences on the battlefield. He wrote about many things, including same-sex desire. He wrote about it in a distinctly American way, using phrases like the manly love of comrades. This wording linked the idea of same-sex desire to the idea of the American man. In a previous video, we discussed how the American man is not a real man, but the idea of what the ideal American man should be. Walt Whitman received widespread criticism for writing about same-sex desire. He was fired from his job because of his poetry, and libraries refused to stock his collections. Even though he received criticism from the public, Walt Whitman was a well-known poet. He corresponded with other famous writers at the time and received many letters from male admirers. To review, During the time of the Civil War, a large percentage of the population was Christian. Many people immigrated from Asian and European countries, and many minority groups formed their own communities and cultures within America. The Civil War was fought over slavery and was an extremely violent and brutal war. Many young men lied about their age to enlist. Many women dressed and passed as men to fight. Loretta Velasquez dressed as a man and fought in the Civil War. Albert Cashier did as well, but unlike Velasquez, he continued to dress as a man for the rest of his life. The public was fascinated by cross-dressing soldiers. Walt Whitman wrote poetry about same-sex desire and received widespread criticism for it, but was still a popular poet. When the Civil War ended, so did slavery in America, but many African Americans continued to face violence and discrimination.